So this formation period, which is the second stage of this journey, will end on the first Sunday of Lent. And then throughout Lent, we're going to be in the third stage. And the third stage is called the Enlightenment period, because in the early church, those who had been in this formation stage, which lasted much longer. It could last as long as 3 years in some cases, which is the same amount of time as a seminary education nowadays. If you can imagine a congregation full of seminary educated congregation, you can understand, feel what that one might be like. But in any event, those who had been through that process and who decided that they wanted to be baptized would be enrolled as candidates for enlightenment in the sacrament. So that's where the name comes from. And during that period, which was especially, I think we talked about this in one of the other sessions, was a very stressful period, potentially, because time of great temptation, because the decision to be baptism was to be baptized in a time when you could be martyred, literally, if you were discovered to be a Christian. It was kind of a weighty decision. And so there were lots of people who were tempted to just not be baptized at all. Or if they were, in any event, it was a time when the church would sort of gather around. In fact, there is a description of that in the prayer book. If I can find it here. Here it is. So come in. So here's a preface for part of the Ash Wednesday service. The celebrant addresses everybody who is present for the service and says, "Dear people of God, the first Christians observed with great devotion the days of our Lord's passion and resurrection, and it became the custom of the church." See, it's not a tradition, it's a custom. You remember that difference? A tradition is what we have formally handed over, what I also written, it has to do with the creeds, it has to do with the sacraments, but customs have to do with just practices that we developed over time of living together. Like family dinners or Thanksgiving customs and those kinds of things. So it became a custom of the church to prepare for them by a season of penitence and fasting. The season of Lent provided a time in which converts to the faith were prepared for holy baptism, and it became a time when those who, because of notorious sins, for example, those who had renounced the faith during times of persecution, could be and had been separated from the body of the faithful, were reconciled by penitence and forgiveness, and restored to the fellowship of the church. Thereby the whole congregation was put in mind of the message of pardon and absolution set forth in the gospel of our Savior, and the need which all Christians continually have to renew their faith by repentance and faith. So during Lent, our focus is going to be on daily prayer. This is since Lent is a season, the prayer book says, is a season of when it's appropriate for special acts of prayer and devotion, such as fasting or taking up vows or whatever your custom is there. During Lent, our focus is going to be on daily prayer. So this will be the third resource that we are sharing with you. The first resource is our own lives, and the story of the people of God, how Christians throughout the centuries as a church have been called into the church, and the church is seen as a community of faith living throughout the world. And so our own stories, the way God has revealed himself to us, the way he's revealed himself to one another, the way we share our faith with one another in a community of faith, which is the church throughout our lives and throughout history. That's the first resource we have. The next resource is the resource that we're talking about now, which is, come in, which is that God calls us week by week to gather together, to assemble as the people of God, called out of the world into an assembly to hear and respond to his word, which he is speaking to us as his church. The word church meaning ecclesia, those who have been called out, literally in Greek, ecclesia, called out to assemble. And so we've been looking at the liturgy of the word, which is the first part of the communion of the Eucharist service. And I'm going to be talking today about the Psalms and about the way we hear the New Testament lesson. The third resource we will share will be the one we take up during Lent, which is that not only can we be connected to one another and to God week by week or throughout our lives, but we can also be connected to God in daily prayer. And the church has developed over centuries ways of praying, and I'll be sharing those resources with you, and particularly focusing on the daily office that we have in our Book of Common Prayer, and the lessons that are appointed for each day, and how you discover them, and the types of prayer, and that sort of thing. But because this season of Lent was, as we just heard in the description of Ash Wednesday, a time when those who were preparing for baptism would be enrolled as candidates, we're going to give you the opportunity, if you have not been baptized, or if you have not been confirmed, or if you would like to be received into the Episcopal Church from, say, the Roman Catholic Church, or if you would like to simply reaffirm your baptismal commitment before the bishop, we have the rite of enrollment. You know, we've had those several different rites, so we'll have an opportunity on the first Sunday of Lent for you to come forward and do that. And if you would, once again, you have this resource that we call variously spiritual direction, or whatever, it's soul friend, or an opportunity to meet with one of the clergy. If you have any questions about any of these things, as we have done at each of these transitions between one stage and the next, there's an opportunity for you to meet with one of us on the clergy and say, what is this all about? Or why do I need to do this? Or suppose this is, or here I've got a question about this that I didn't really get answered in class, and I didn't want to take up anybody else's time to ask it, but now that I've got you here, what gives? You know? That kind of thing. So, is all that? And Father Nicholas will be sending out an email blast with explanations about all this.
So when is first Sunday of Lent? Is it February?
I knew you were gonna
Well,
ask
here-
me that.
Lent starts on,
February 14th.
yes,
Is it February 14th?
Valentine's Day.
Is
Yeah.
Ash Wednesday
Mhm.
this
It's
year?
really early.
Yes, it is very early.
So the first Sunday would be right after,
Right,
the
the first
18th.
Sunday of Lent would be the
18th.
Sunday, 18th?
Yep.
Okay, the 18th.
I know,
And
I want to be received, then I realize I'll be leaving on the 15th, all the way to Hong Kong,
yes, but when will you be back from Hong Kong?
March the 6th.
Okay, good. So you'll just be signed up, or you'll just let us know when you sign up. But anyway, when you would actually be received is the next time the bishop comes.
So when will be the next,
I don't know.
whenever?
Whenever.
I don't want to be alone.
You
Just
won't
by
be.
myself.
You won't be. You won't be.
Oh, okay, I
You'll-
will just
you'll-
hear it
You'll
there.
be okay. You'll be okay.
Okay.
You'll be okay. You are okay.
everybody will be,
This is-
done
I'm okay,
in
you're
Lent.
okay, but-
And then, right, everybody will be either reaffirm or receive February 18.
No, they just sign up for that.
Oh, just sign up, okay.
That's the right of enrollment,
Got it.
to say that you wanna be,
Oh, okay.
okay.
Feel better.
Now you feel better? Okay. Okay. However, you did ask an important question, and that is, when does Lent start? And the reason that is important is because it's very early this year. Do you remember how Easter is calculated?
First Sunday after the first equinox, whatever.
The first Sunday after the first full moon
That's right.
after the spring equinox. Now, if you happen to be a Greek Orthodox Christian or a Russian Orthodox Christian, you wouldn't have to mess around with this, because they calculate it on the basis of Passover. So for them, Easter is the first Sunday after Passover.
Oh, so that's easy.
We made a
Easter's
wrong
March-
decision, but we made it in the
March
3rd century,
31,
so we've
yeah.
been stuck with it. Okay, but what that means for us today is that we have to cover 2 chapters in one session, and I'm already behind. So what we're going to be talking about today is how we hear the Psalms, how we use the Psalms in church during the liturgy of the Word, and how we hear the New Testament reading, not the Gospel. We'll have a separate session on the Gospel. But today we're going to be talking about, in effect, chapter 6 and chapter 7 in your book, okay? And we're still going to have time for you to talk about this, have your small group time. So hold on to your seats. In a way, you can think about the Psalms in relation to the Old Testament reading as part of our response to the Word of God, right? So we hear and respond. So the Old Testament lesson is read as the first lesson, and then we have a response to the first lesson, and our response is to recite a psalm. Does that make sense? And the Psalms, and that makes sense not only liturgically for us, but it's also how the Psalms developed historically in the worship of Israel. And that is that the Psalms were always liturgical poetry, liturgical hymns. And so they are written many times in a way to be used in a congregation of worship in response to a reading of the scriptures. For us, the Old Testament scriptures. So you hear the Old Testament read, and then either the choir will sing, and we will just recite it ourselves verbally. I mean, not without music. Now it helps because the Psalms are written as poetry and as Hebrew poetry, and we're very blessed. I don't know who chose Hebrew as a language of revelation, but it was a very smart choice. Because, I was gonna write this out, but then Susan won't be able to see it, I don't think. But if you look in your book, if you have your book with you, on page 180, there is Psalm 24. And watch the way this works. Hebrew poetry does not depend upon sound rhymes, which is fortunate, because that, like, what's a good sound rhyme that we have? I can't think of a single poem right now.
Jack and Jill went up the hill, catch pail of water, Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after.
Good. Water after, crown, right? Okay, so those sounds. Okay, Hebrew poetry doesn't work like that. That would not work if you translated it into Hebrew. But Hebrew works if you translate it into English. And it also, Hebrew poetry doesn't depend on meter. You remember I said that I was listening to a YouTube talk on Bob Dylan's poetry, and it said that the song, Tangled Up in Blue is a sonnet sequence. It's got, each stanza has 14 lines, except a sonnet in English, most of them that I know are iambic pentameter. To-do. Well, Tangled Up in Blue doesn't work that way. Tangled Up in Blue is a 4/3. To-do thing. Anyway, Hebrew poetry doesn't care about that. What Hebrew poetry cares about are thought rhymes. Each thought is echoed by another thought in the next half of the verse. So let's look at Psalm 24, and you'll see how it works. The earth is the Lord's. This is a familiar one, right? The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and all that dwell therein. Now this is in parallel. So what is the parallel to the word earth?
World.
World. What is the parallel to the fullness thereof? Those who dwell therein, right? See the way it works? Now you can, the way poets do, and they can switch that around, they can make it go crossways, or they can make it go. But generally speaking, the way to hear the poem of the Psalms, the poetry of the Psalms, is to think, okay, what word is rhyming, or what thought is rhyming with this thought? So the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world, and all that dwell therein. Well, you can see what's happening, right? You can, in fact, I'll tell you the truth, I learned to do this when I was in the 3rd grade. And I learned it not at a religious school. I learned it at a regular secular school, because I was in this little, it wasn't a one-room schoolhouse, but it was pretty close. I had 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades all in one classroom. And the teacher would divide us up, and there would be boys on one side and girls on the other, or, and we'd say, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And the other side would say, the world and they that dwell therein. For he has founded upon the seas. He has established it upon the floods. Hear how that goes?
Yeah.
Founded, established, seas, floods. See? So it works very naturally, and of course that's exactly how it would have been used in poetry or in worship, in temple worship, for example, or synagogue worship, for centuries before Jesus. Now, our prayer book identifies several different ways we can do it. We can read it in unison, in which everybody just reads the whole psalm together. You lose all that. Or we can read it responsively, in which we read, they say the prayer book says we should read it responsively by whole verse. I personally don't like that, because I think the verse is written to be done by half verse. See, why would you say the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all that dwells therein? For he has founded upon the seas, and see it and break it up by whole verse when it doesn't rhyme that way. Anyway, nobody listens to me and nobody asks me before they wrote the prayer book, so there you go.
Father Steve, is there a difference? Like, I've been in different churches that one reads by whole verse, one reads responsibly by half verse. Does the 3-year setup for the thing tell you guys how you have to do it, or every church is different?
Yeah, every church is different.
Yeah, because the church I went to in Philadelphia, always by half verse.
Yeah, I always did it by half verse too. Here we do it by whole verse. And the prayer book says do it by whole verse, so, who am I? Who are we?
That's the thing today.
Right. So anyway, so that's another, the other way to do it is antiphonally, which is what I was describing. That's the way I learned to do it in the 3rd grade. And I can still, and it works not only, one of the I've gone back to the 3rd grade, and there were at that time shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by night, and lo, an angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone on, and they were sore afraid, and
I think that'd be a good way to do that.
that's a great way. Anyway, that's how you use the psalm. Now, there's a problem with the Psalms, sometimes, and that is, some songs are just hard to, I mean, for example, do you know the Bob Marley song by the waters of Babylon? We sat down, we remembered Zion. They require, you know, by the waters of the, anyway, there's a beautiful poem, it's 137, and it's here. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Now this is, the setup is the people of Israel, Jerusalem has fallen to Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, southern Iraq. That's why Saddam Hussein kept a statue of, you know, Nebuchadnezzar in Baghdad, because he's the one that conquered Jerusalem. Okay, so, and the people have been carried off to slavery in Babylon. So they're sitting down by the waters of Babylon, and the captors say, sing us one of those nice songs. You guys, sing us one of those songs of Zion, that's, you're such fun, you all, you slaves. Come on, sing it, get up and dance. And so, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land, it asks. And then it goes on to say, O daughter of Babylon, you devastator, happy shall be those who requires of you what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who takes your little ones and dashes their heads against a rock. It's in the Bible, right? So,
Doesn't come up much on Sundays.
yeah, so how can you use, well, there's two schools of thought. One is you don't. It just isn't appropriate to ever read that in a Christian context. Because after all, we're supposed to forgive our enemies, to love those who are, pray for those who persecute us, and to do all this. However, St. Augustine had another way of reading it. Remember that I said last week, as we talked about how do you interpret the Old Testament in a way that bears witness to Christ? And I said there's a couple of ways, but one way is to find in the Old Testament a type of things in the New Testament. So as the people, as God saved, whoops, there it is. I've got 5 minutes now. As God saved those people from saved the world by the waters of the flood in the ark, so the church is the new ark, and we're saved by the waters of baptism from the destruction brought about by our sins. Okay, that's one way of doing it. The other way is just to find fulfillment. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah when he said this. So here's what Augustine did with this. He said, we know, because Paul tells us, that the rock is Christ. Because remember when they were in Israel, and when they were in the desert, the people of Israel smote the rock and water came down. You may not remember it, but it's there, trust me. So Paul says, we know the rock is Christ, we know the water is baptism, and we know that the little ones are my sins. And so what we're really praying is for my sins to be dashed upon the rock of Christ, that I may be saved by the waters of baptism. And that's the way we can read that psalm.
That's a reach.
That's a reach. That's a reach. I'm just saying. I didn't make that up, St. Augustine did. And so that's a reach. But it does conform. Paul says the rock is Christ. Paul says the water comes out. It's in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that when they struck the rock, water came out. And Paul says, see, the rock is a type of Christ. So if that's true of that verse, then why not apply it to this verse?
How did this sound get selected, and this one get selected, and others, there must have been others that were not selected. So what was the process then by which they entered into this? I don't understand this.
Somebody sat down and said, let's read this one. Now, there's in what you may be, I don't know if this is what you were asking, there's two different parts of that question. First of all, how did it get it into the Bible?
That's what
And
I'm talking about.
yeah, and that's just that happened long before the time of Christ, for example, because it's 300 years before Christ. It's already in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The second question is, how does it get selected for us to read it? And all of our lessons are selected by a group of liturgical scholars and biblical scholars from the Roman Catholic, the Lutheran, the Presbyterian, the Episcopalian, the Methodist, United Church of Christ, anybody who uses what we call the Revised Common Lectionary. So you can go home and you can turn on the TV today and watch a Roman Catholic Mass, for example. They'll hear the same lessons that we're hearing. And that's true for all those other denominations. And some of the way they make that choice is, what have we read on the first Sunday of Lent in the year 1500? Let's go back and see,
How often is it changed? Yearly?
We have a 3-year lectionary cycle. So every year, and I'll talk about this more when we talk about the gospel, but the cycle is based on the gospel. So in year A, we read from the Gospel of Matthew.
I understand that part, but in terms of selecting what to be read.
That's it.
Periodically.
That's
the
probably,
corollary.
the
Yeah.
1928 prayer book lectionary was revised. 28 prayer book was a revision of the 1882 prayer book, and the 1882 prayer book was a revision of the 1789 prayer book. So those lessons were revised.
Okay.
The common lectionary.
1962 revision?
1979 is our prayer
Oh, is
book.
the one now, but there was a 62?
There's a 1662, which is what they use in England, if they're not using the new book. Okay, but in any event, so every time there was the common lectionary was developed for the new prayer book, and then some people said, you know what, we don't get to read the Old Testament consistently, let's revise that. So we're using the revised common lectionary in today. I'm sorry I gotta run, but I gotta get you to the New Testament readings. The New Testament readings are selected from part of the New Testament that is not a gospel. Okay, so we have a gospel reading, and then we have a New Testament reading, and the New Testament reading is read after the psalm. So most of the time, those readings will be from the letters of Paul, because Paul is the bulk of those writings that is not one of the Gospels. And how are the letters of Paul organized?
Size.
Length.
Who said that?
GPS.
Size, right.
Size matters.
That's right. Whoever has the most chapters wins.
That's
Okay. So Romans has got more chapters than 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians has more chapters than 2 Corinthians. And after that, it's Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. How do I know that?
Oh.
Because
That's
it's
the gas.
General Electric Power
Power
Corporation.
Yeah.
Or Gentiles eat pork chops.
Oh
That's how it's saying. So after that are the epistles of some of the others, John and Peter and Jude and those, and then finally the book of Revelation as the last book of the Bible. Which, if you remember your Pat Boone, get your Holy Bible in the back of the book of Revelation is the place you look. If you understand it and you can't even try, the Lord is coming from his throne on high. And with that, you can go.